Anna Blake was a name whispered with respect, admiration, and, for some, fear within the walls of the police force. As the head of internal affairs, her reputation for rooting out corruption and holding officers accountable was legendary. She was known for her calm demeanor, razor-sharp intellect, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Despite her formidable position, Anna preferred to stay out of the spotlight, dressing modestly and driving a nondescript car that didn't hint at her powerful role. To many, she looked like an ordinary woman, and she liked it that way. It allowed her to move through the world without the burden of constant recognition, and, more importantly, it gave her an unfiltered look at how the system she worked to uphold really operated. It was late in the evening, and Anna was returning home after a grueling day of meetings and disciplinary hearings. Her car, a practical silver sedan with a few scratches and dents, rolled into the parking lot of a small gas station on the outskirts of the city. This wasn't her usual route home, but she had decided to stop for a quick break. The area wasn't particularly inviting, a dimly lit lot with flickering streetlights and a few scattered cars, but she wasn't concerned. She had spent years navigating far more dangerous situations. The gas station's neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the asphalt, and the air smelled faintly of gasoline and fried food from the attached convenience store. Anna parked her car in one of the spots furthest from the store, grabbed her wallet, and stepped out. She was wearing a casual outfit, a pair of dark jeans, a plain navy blouse, and a light jacket. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her face, though tired, carried an air of quiet confidence. As she opened her trunk to grab a small travel bag, she noticed a patrol car pulling into the lot. The car slowed as it approached, its headlights briefly illuminating her. Anna didn't think much of it at first. Officers often patrolled this area, given its reputation for petty crime and loitering. Behind the wheel of the patrol car sat Officer Mike Hardy, a mid-30s cop who had spent nearly a decade on the force. Mike had joined the police department with dreams of making a difference, but years of disappointment, personal failures, and his own unchecked biases had hardened him. Recently reprimanded for misconduct, he was bitter and frustrated, convinced the world was against him. Tonight, his shift had been uneventful, a fact that only added to his simmering resentment. When he saw Anna, a black woman alone in a mostly empty parking lot, his instincts, shaped more by prejudice than reason, flared. "What's she doing here?" he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her car looked out of place to him, her demeanor too confident, and in his mind, that was enough to warrant suspicion. He decided to investigate, partly out of boredom, partly out of a desire to reassert the authority he felt slipping away in other areas of his life. He flicked on the patrol car's lights and pulled up behind her vehicle. Anna glanced up from her bag, her brow furrowing slightly as the red and blue lights reflected off her car's rear window. She closed the trunk, her movements unhurried, and turned to face the officer as he stepped out of his car. Mike was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the air of someone who had been itching for a confrontation. His hand rested casually on the grip of his holstered gun as he approached, a gesture that Anna didn't miss. She immediately recognized the type of officer who thrived on intimidation, someone who used their badge as a weapon rather than a shield. "Evening," Mike said curtly, his tone sharp. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "What are you doing here?" Anna tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but guarded. "Good evening, officer. I'm just stopping to grab something from the convenience store. Is there a problem?" Mike's eyes narrowed. Her composed response irritated him. Most people in this area would have been nervous, stammering, or eager to explain themselves. But she wasn't like most people. He took another step closer, his posture stiffening. "This area's been under surveillance for criminal activity," he said, his voice growing louder. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Anna raised an eyebrow. She knew exactly what he was doing, fishing for an excuse to escalate the situation. She also knew that fit the description was often code for racial profiling. Still, she kept her tone neutral. "I wasn't aware of that. I'm just passing through on my way home." Mike crossed his arms, his gaze hardening. "License and registration," he demanded. Anna sighed internally. She had done nothing wrong, but she understood the importance of staying calm in situations like this. She reached into her pocket and retrieved her driver's license, handing it to him without a word. He took it roughly, barely glancing at it before shoving it into his pocket. "What's in the trunk?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "Mind if I take a look?" Anna's patience was beginning to wear thin. She crossed her arms, her expression unchanging. "Yes, I do mind. You have no probable cause to search my vehicle." Mike's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had already decided was guilty of something. "If you've got nothing to hide, then you shouldn't have a problem with me looking," he snapped. Anna took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Officer, unless you have a warrant or a legitimate reason to search my car, I'm going to have to decline. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to go inside and get what I came here for." Her calm refusal only fueled Mike's frustration. To him, her confidence felt like defiance, and it was a direct challenge to his authority. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his hand once again brushing the grip of his gun. "Listen here," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I don't like your attitude. If you don't cooperate, things are going to get real difficult for you." Anna met his gaze steadily, unflinching. She could feel her heart pounding, but years of experience had taught her to never let her emotions show in moments like this. "Officer," she said, her voice firm, "you're dangerously close to overstepping your authority. I suggest you think carefully about your next move." Mike stared at her for a long moment, the tension between them thick and palpable. He was used to having the upper hand, to people backing down under his glare, but this woman wasn't backing down. If anything, her unwavering calm seemed to strip away his sense of control, leaving him more desperate to assert his dominance. He finally stepped back, his lips curling into a sneer. "Fine, stay here," he said, turning back toward his patrol car. "I'm calling this in." As Mike walked away, Anna allowed herself a moment to exhale. She reached into her pocket and subtly activated the recording app on her phone, slipping it back into her jacket. She had a feeling this encounter was far from over. Mike Hardy stomped back to his patrol car, the weight of his frustration mounting with every step. His pride was stung. Anna Blake's calm demeanor, her refusal to cower under his authority, gnawed at him. He wasn't used to people, particularly those who looked like her, standing their ground against him. As he sat down in the driver's seat, his hands gripped the radio, the plastic creaking under the pressure. He debated his next move, anger clouding his judgment. He clicked the radio. "Unit 12 to dispatch," he said, forcing his voice to remain calm though it trembled with barely contained fury. "I've got a suspicious vehicle and individual at the Westside gas station. Requesting a background check on license plate Alpha Zulu 3467. Possible resistance to law enforcement." The radio crackled back with static, followed by a voice. "Copy that, Unit 12. Running the plates now. Stand by." Mike glanced out the window toward Anna, who was now leaning against her car with her arms crossed. She hadn't moved, and her posture was as composed as ever, her face unreadable. She didn't fidget, didn't show the slightest hint of fear. To Mike, it felt like a deliberate challenge, and he couldn't stand it. He didn't want to wait for dispatch to run a check. He needed to take control now. He slammed the door of his patrol car and marched back toward her, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel. His hand instinctively hovered near his holstered gun, a habit that had long since become second nature, though he had no intention of using it yet. He stopped a few feet away from Anna, the harsh light from the gas station casting long shadows between them. "All right," Mike said sharply. "I've got some questions for you, and I suggest you start cooperating." Anna raised an eyebrow, her calm expression unchanging. "Officer, I've already given you my license. What more do you need?" Mike's jaw clenched. "You think this is a game?" he barked, stepping closer. "You're in a high-crime area, driving a car that doesn't look like it belongs here. You're acting suspicious. And I've got every right to investigate further." Anna's lips pressed into a thin line, though her eyes remained steady on his. She spoke evenly, her tone controlled. "You're assuming a lot without evidence, Officer Hardy. High-crime area or not, I'm within my rights to be here. I'm not committing any crime, and you have no grounds to continue this line of questioning." Her use of his name plucked from the nameplate on his chest hit like a slap. It was precise, deliberate, and another reminder that she wasn't just some random woman he could intimidate. It made his temper flare. "I asked you what's in the trunk," he snapped, pointing toward the rear of her car. "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind opening it." Anna took a slow breath, weighing her words carefully. She understood exactly what he was trying to do. The entire interaction was a trap, a calculated series of provocations designed to get her to react in a way he could interpret as hostile or uncooperative. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I've already told you, Officer Hardy, you don't have probable cause to search my car. And unless you produce a warrant or a legitimate reason, I won't be opening my trunk." Her voice was calm but firm, each word deliberate. Mike's face darkened. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the faint tang of sweat and the stale coffee on his breath. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "When I give an order, I expect it to be followed. You don't get to decide what's suspicious. I do. And right now you're looking real suspicious." Anna met his gaze, unblinking. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. "And I expect you to follow the law," she replied coolly. "What you're doing right now, this intimidation, these baseless accusations, it's harassment. I suggest you reconsider before this situation escalates any further." Mike's fists tightened at his sides. The tension between them was thick, almost palpable. He wanted to push further, to press her until she cracked, but something about her unshakable composure unnerved him. It wasn't the reaction he was used to. People usually backed down, caved under his scrutiny, but not her. She was different, and it made him feel like he was losing control of the encounter. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the small crowd forming near the entrance to the convenience store. A couple of bystanders stood with their phones raised, filming the interaction. Mike's stomach tightened. He hated being recorded. It made him feel exposed, vulnerable, like every decision he made could be dissected and scrutinized. He needed to end this now, before things spiraled further. "Step away from the car," he ordered, his voice sharp. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood." Anna's eyes narrowed slightly, the first hint of irritation flickering across her face. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Mike said, taking a step closer. "You're being detained for suspicious activity." She didn't move immediately, her gaze locked on his. Then, with deliberate slowness, she turned and placed her hands on the hood of her car. Her movements were calm, measured, and completely unbothered, as though she was letting him know that she was complying not because she was intimidated, but because she chose to. Mike reached for his handcuffs, his hands trembling slightly. The weight of the crowd's eyes on him, the hum of the phones recording every second, and Anna's infuriatingly composed demeanor all pressed down on him like a vice. He had to assert his authority, to prove that he was in control, even if he wasn't sure he actually was. "You're making a mistake," Anna said, her voice calm and steady, as he pulled her arms behind her back. "A very big mistake." "Save it," Mike snapped, snapping the cuffs onto her wrists. "You can explain yourself at the station." As he secured the cuffs, one of the bystanders called out, "Hey man, what's she even doing wrong?" "She's just standing there." "Stay out of this," Mike barked, his voice echoing through the parking lot. He turned his attention back to Anna, who was now being led toward his patrol car. She didn't resist, didn't protest. She simply walked alongside him, her expression unreadable. As he opened the back door of the patrol car, Anna finally spoke again. "You should check the name on my license, Officer Hardy. You might find it enlightening." Mike scoffed, shoving her into the back seat. "Yeah, I'll get right on that," he muttered, slamming the door shut. Back in the driver's seat, he grabbed her license from his pocket and held it up to the dim light inside the car. His eyes scanned the name, Anna Blake. The name tugged at something in the back of his mind, but he couldn't immediately place it. His frustration flared again. Whoever she thought she was, it didn't matter. She was in his custody now, and that meant he was in control, or so he thought. What he didn't realize was that this was only the beginning of a night that would unravel his career and shatter his delusions of power. As the patrol car doors slammed shut, Anna Blake sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. The hard plastic of the seat dug into her as the weight of the cuffs pressed against her wrists, but her posture remained upright and composed. Outside, the small crowd that had gathered by the convenience store murmured amongst themselves, several people continuing to record the scene on their phones. The glow of their screens reflected in the glass, and Anna could see their blurred faces as she sat silently, awaiting what she knew would inevitably happen. Officer Mike Hardy paced near the hood of her car, his frustration evident in his sharp, agitated movements. The adrenaline coursing through him made his hands twitch as he tapped the license against his thigh, his mind racing. Something about her name had struck a chord, but he couldn't quite place it. His mind, clouded by the need to assert his authority and the embarrassment of the growing audience, refused to focus on anything other than regaining control of the situation. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. He barked into his radio, his voice sharper than he intended. "I'm bringing in a suspect for questioning. Suspicious individual, possibly obstructing justice. Name's Anna Blake. Run a background check and get back to me." There was a long pause on the line, the static crackling faintly. Mike tapped his foot impatiently, glancing toward the patrol car where Anna sat. She hadn't said a word since being cuffed, and that silence, steady, unnerving, and deliberate, made him feel as though he were the one under scrutiny. He hated it. Finally, the dispatcher's voice broke through. "Copy that, Unit 12. Running the name now. Stand by." Mike exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the cool night air. He turned back toward the car, catching sight of the crowd. A young woman in a sweatshirt and jeans stood at the forefront, her phone raised, the bright red circle of a recording app unmistakable on her screen. "Hey," he snapped, pointing at her. "Step back. This is official police business. If you interfere, I'll have you arrested." The young woman didn't flinch. She didn't do anything. She called back, her voice clear and firm. "We saw the whole thing. She was just standing there, and you're harassing her." Mike clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to lash out further. He couldn't afford for this to escalate any more than it already had. Turning away from the crowd, he approached the driver's side of his patrol car and opened the door, leaning in to address Anna directly. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, his tone low and cutting. "Sitting back there all quiet, acting like you're above this. Let me tell you something you're not. You might think you're in control, but you're not. I run this show." Anna finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "Officer Hardy, I've been nothing but cooperative. Your behavior tonight has been unprofessional and dangerous. You're escalating a situation that never needed to happen." Her words hit like a slap, and Mike's face flushed with anger. "You don't get to lecture me about professionalism," he snapped, leaning closer. "You're in the back of my car, cuffed, because you decided to play games. I'm in the back of your car because you've made a series of poor decisions," Anna replied evenly. "And unless you want those decisions to haunt you for the rest of your career, I suggest you take a moment to reconsider your next move." Her composure only fueled his frustration. Mike slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating across the parking lot, and took a few steps away, running a hand through his hair. The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the radio. "Unit 12, the name Anna Blake is coming up in the system. Cross-referencing now, wait." There was a pause, followed by a shift in the dispatcher's tone. "Officer Hardy, are you certain about the name?" Mike frowned, reaching for his radio. "Yeah, I'm certain. Why?" Another pause, heavier this time. "You might want to double-check your information, Unit 12. Anna Blake, she's flagged as the head of internal affairs for your department." Mike's blood ran cold. His grip on the radio tightened as the words sank in, each syllable like a weight pulling him further into the realization of his mistake. Internal affairs. The very department tasked with investigating misconduct, holding officers accountable, and ensuring the integrity of the force. And he had just cuffed its head, humiliated her in front of a crowd, and dragged her into his patrol car like a common criminal. "Dispatch," he said after a beat, his voice strained. "Are you absolutely sure about that?" The response was immediate and unflinching. 100% sure, Unit 12. You've got yourself in a situation. I suggest you proceed with extreme caution." For a moment, Mike couldn't move. His mind raced, replaying every second of the encounter with a growing sense of dread. The way she had spoken, her unshakable calm, her refusal to be intimidated, it all made sense now. She had been giving him opportunities to step back, to realize what he was doing, and he had ignored every one of them. He turned toward the patrol car, his stomach twisting into knots. Anna sat exactly as she had before, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything, her silence spoke volumes. Mike hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. What was he supposed to do now? Admit he had made a mistake? Release her and hope she didn't file a report? The crowd was still there, phone still recording. Whatever he did next would be on display for everyone to see. He approached the car and opened the door, his movements slower this time. "Miss Blake," he began, his tone forced and awkward. "Hi, there's been a misunderstanding." Anna raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "A misunderstanding," she echoed. "That's what you're calling this?" Mike swallowed hard. "Look, I didn't realize that I'm the head of internal affairs." Anna finished for him. "No, you didn't. And now you're trying to backpedal because you know exactly how bad this looks." "I was just doing my job," Mike said defensively, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Your job," Anna repeated, her tone cold. Your job, Officer Hardy, is to uphold the law, protect the public, and conduct yourself with professionalism and integrity. Tell me, how much of that have you done tonight? Mike flinched, her words hitting with the precision of a scalpel. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the young woman from the crowd called out again. Hey, did you even run her name before you cuffed her? Everyone's going to see this, you know. You're screwed, man. The murmurs of agreement from the crowd made Mike's face burn with shame. He turned toward them, his temper flaring. I said, "Step back." He barked, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. Anna's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Enough, Officer Hardy. Every second you waste yelling at bystanders is another second you dig yourself deeper into this mess. He turned back to her, his chest heaving. She held his gaze, her expression firm but not unkind. For the first time that night, Mike felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly, the fight draining from his voice. Anna leaned forward slightly, her tone measured. "First, uncuff me. Then we're going to have a very serious conversation about what happens next." Mike hesitated, his pride screaming at him to push back, but he knew it was over. With trembling hands, he reached for the cuffs, fumbling slightly as he unlocked them. As soon as the metal clicked free, Anna rubbed her wrists briefly before stepping out of the car. She turned to face him fully, her gaze piercing. "Now," she said, her voice firm but steady, "you're going to explain to this crowd exactly what you've done here tonight. And after that, you're going to prepare yourself for the consequences. Because trust me, Officer Hardy, there will be consequences." Mike's heart sank as the crowd closed in slightly, their phones still raised, their voices buzzing with anticipation. For the first time in his career, he truly understood what it meant to be held accountable, and it terrified him. Anna stood firm, the crowd watching her with a mix of awe and righteous indignation. Mike Hardy's face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he struggled to maintain the semblance of authority. His hands hovered uselessly at his sides, the key to the handcuffs he had just removed feeling heavier than it should have. His mind scrambled for a way out, but there was none. The phones recording every movement, every word, made sure of that. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Someone muttered, "She's going to take him down," while others whispered about how Mike's career was likely over. The weight of public scrutiny bore down on him, making it nearly impossible to think clearly. And Anna, calm and unyielding, was the epicenter of it all. She wasn't gloating, wasn't raging, she didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any accusation she could have voiced. "You said we needed to have a conversation, Ms. Blake," Mike said at last, his voice low and tight. He was trying to sound professional, but the slight quiver betrayed his rising panic. Let's have it." Anna tilted her head slightly, studying him. She wasn't in a rush. She had already regained control of the situation, and now it was Mike who squirmed under the weight of it. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured and deliberate. "First, you're going to explain to this crowd why you detained me. Every single word of it. Because they deserve to know the kind of officer who's supposed to protect them." Mike's jaw tightened. "Look, I made a judgment call. The area." Anna cut him off, her voice sharp and commanding. "No, Officer Hardy, not excuses. Facts. What crime did I commit? What probable cause did you have? Why did you decide that I, standing by my own car, was a threat?" The crowd erupted in murmurs again, emboldened by Anna's words. Someone shouted, "Yeah, tell us, Hardy." "What did she do?" Another voice chimed in, racial profiling. "That's what." Mike's face burned red. He turned briefly toward the crowd, his hand instinctively raising to quiet them, but it was no use. They were growing louder, their outrage feeding off Anna's composure and his visible discomfort. He looked back at her, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find an answer. "You fit the description," he blurted finally, the words weak and hollow even to his own ears. Anna arched an eyebrow, her expression unimpressed. "The description," she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "And what description was that, Officer Hardy?" "A black woman standing near her own car. Or did you have something more specific?" The crowd roared with laughter and indignation. Someone shouted, "That's all they ever need." Another voice added, "Betty didn't even run her plates before jumping on her." Mike clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "This area has a history of criminal activity," he snapped, his voice rising defensively. "I was doing my job, trying to keep the community safe." Anna didn't flinch. She took a step closer to him, her gaze unrelenting. "Let me tell you something about doing your job, Officer Hardy. Your job is to protect and serve, not harass and profile. Your job is to ensure the safety of every citizen, regardless of their race, gender, or where they happen to be standing. And tonight you failed at your job. Spectacularly." Her words were clear and cutting, each one striking Mike like a blow. He wanted to argue to defend himself, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had made a series of assumptions, acted on them without evidence, and now he was trapped in the aftermath of his own recklessness. The tension was broken by the sound of another police car pulling into the lot, its sirens off but its lights flashing. The crowd turned as two officers stepped out, their faces serious as they took in the scene. One of them, a sergeant with greying hair and a calm but authoritative presence, approached quickly. His badge read Harper. "What's going on here?" Sergeant Harper asked, his voice steady but firm. His eyes darted between Mike, the crowd, and Anna, assessing the situation with practiced efficiency. Before Mike could respond, Anna stepped forward. "Sergeant Harper," she said, her tone professional. "It's good to see you. I believe we have a bit of a situation here." Harper's brows furrowed in confusion, and then his eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Ems Blake," he said, his voice tinged with surprise and unease. "What are you doing here?" Anna smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "I was on my way home when Officer Hardy decided I was suspicious and detained me without cause. He also attempted to search my vehicle unlawfully and handcuffed me in front of witnesses." Harper's face darkened, and he turned to Mike, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Is this true?" he demanded. Mike opened his mouth, desperate to explain himself, but no words came. The crowd was silent now, their phones still raised as they eagerly awaited what would happen next. Finally, he stammered, I thought." "You thought?" Harper interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You thought what, Hardy? That a woman standing by her car was a criminal? That you could cuff her without evidence and hope for the best?" Mike's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the sergeant's reprimand. "I didn't know who she was," he said weakly. Harper's eyes flashed with anger. "It doesn't matter who she is. You don't treat anyone like this, let alone the head of internal affairs." The crowd gasped audibly, the revelation hitting them like a thunderclap. Whispers of internal affairs? "And she's his boss," rippled through the group. The phones shifted focus, zooming in on Anna as she stood tall and composed, the undisputed center of attention. Anna held up a hand, silencing both Harper and the crowd. "Sergeant Harper, I appreciate your intervention, but this situation requires more than a reprimand. Officer Hardy's actions tonight were not just a failure of judgment, they were a blatant abuse of power." Harper nodded solemnly. I understand, Ms. Blake. I'll make sure a report is filed immediately. Anna's gaze hardened. It won't just be a report, Sergeant. There will be an investigation. This isn't the first time I've encountered officers like Hardy, and unless the department takes meaningful action, it won't be the last. Harper nodded again, his expression grim. Understood. Turning back to Mike, Anna stepped closer, her voice dropping so only he could hear. I gave you every opportunity to do the right thing tonight. You chose arrogance over integrity, and now you'll face the consequences. I hope, for your sake, that you learn from this. Mike's head hung low, his face a mask of humiliation and regret. He wanted to apologize, to plead for forgiveness, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew it was too late. Anna turned back to the crowd, addressing them directly. Thank you all for your vigilance tonight. Your recordings and your voices have helped ensure that accountability will be upheld. Please continue to hold your officers to the highest standards. It's the only way we'll create the change we need. The crowd erupted in applause, their phones capturing every word. As Anna walked away, flanked by Harper and the other officer, the weight of the night settled over the parking lot like a storm finally breaking. For Mike Hardy, it was a night he would never forget, and one that would change his life forever. Sergeant Harper led Anna away from the patrol car, the tension between them palpable. The crowd, now emboldened by the revelation of Anna's identity, grew louder, their voices calling for justice. Phones stayed raised, recording every moment of the unfolding drama. Officer Mike Hardy stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and regret. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a tidal wave, each second bringing with it a deeper understanding of just how badly he had miscalculated. Hardy, over here. Now, Harper barked, his tone sharp enough to snap Mike out of his stupor. The sergeant's expression was a mix of fury and disappointment, his jaw tight as he motioned for Mike to follow him a few steps away from the crowd. Mike hesitated for a moment before obeying, his shoulders hunched like a scolded child. As he approached, he could feel the eyes of the crowd boring into him, their murmurs growing louder. The once silent spectators were now participants, their collective outrage feeding into the already volatile situation. What the hell were you thinking? Harper hissed, keeping his voice low enough to avoid being overheard, but no less venomous. Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm you've just unleashed? She's not just anyone, she's Anna Blake, the head of internal affairs. Do you even comprehend the magnitude of this mess? Mike stammered, his words tripping over themselves in his desperation to explain. I didn't know, Sarge. She didn't et us, he didn't identify herself right away. She was acting suspicious. I thought. You thought? Harper interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You thought cuffing a woman for standing by her car in front of a crowd without a shred of evidence was a good idea. You thought escalating this to the point of humiliation was the right move. You didn't think, Hardy. That's the damn problem. I made a mistake, Mike admitted weakly, his eyes darting toward Anna, who stood a few feet away, speaking to one of Harper's subordinates. She looked completely composed, her posture straight, her voice calm. It was as if the entire ordeal hadn't rattled her in the slightest, which only made Mike feel more powerless. A mistake. Harper shot back, his voice rising slightly. This isn't spilling coffee on your uniform, Hardy. You detained the head of internal affairs, a black woman with no probable cause, and now the entire scene is plastered across half a dozen phones. Do you know what's going to happen when this hits the internet? When this makes its way to the chief? Mike's stomach churned at the thought. He could already picture the headlines, Rogue cop detains internal affairs chief in racial profiling incident. The thought of his career, his life, being dismantled piece by piece under the glare of public scrutiny made his knees weak. "I'll fix it," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. "I'll apologize. Your past apologies," Harper snapped, his voice cutting like a whip. "You've dragged the entire department into this mess. The only thing left to do now is damage control, and even that might not save you." Meanwhile, Anna had finished speaking with the other officer and was now walking toward them, her heels clicking softly against the asphalt. The sound alone was enough to make Mike's pulse quicken. She stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze unwavering. "Sergeant Harper," she said evenly, "I've just informed your colleague that I'll be filing a full report on tonight's incident. I'll also be requesting that every recording from the bystanders be submitted as evidence." Harper nodded grimly. "Understood, Ms. Blake. I'll ensure full cooperation." Anna's eyes shifted to Mike, who instinctively looked away, unable to meet her piercing gaze. "Officer Hardy," she began, her tone cold but controlled, "you've violated multiple protocols tonight. Your actions were not only unprofessional but blatantly discriminatory. You targeted me without cause, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and used excessive force in front of witnesses." "I didn't know who you were," Mike blurted out, desperation creeping into his voice. "If I had known—" Anna raised a hand, silencing him. "That's precisely the problem, Officer Hardy. Your behavior shouldn't change based on who someone is. You didn't detain me because you thought I was a threat. You detained me because I didn't fit your preconceived notion of who belongs here. If I were an ordinary citizen, someone without the resources, connections, or status that I have, how far would you have taken this?" Her words hit Mike like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he possibly say? That she was wrong? That he hadn't been profiling her? The evidence to the contrary was overwhelming, and deep down he knew it. "You're lucky this didn't escalate further," Anna continued, her voice growing sharper. "But let me be very clear, this is far from over. I will be pursuing this matter to its fullest extent. Not just for me, but for every person who's been in my position and hasn't had the power to fight back." The crowd, now fully aware of Anna's identity and the gravity of the situation, began to cheer. A man shouted, "Take him down, lady. Make him pay." Another voice added, "This is what we've been talking about for years. Enough is enough." Mike flinched at the noise, his humiliation deepening. He glanced at Harper, silently begging for intervention, but the sergeant simply shook his head. "She's right, Hardy," Harper said quietly. "You screwed up, and now you're going to face the consequences." At that moment, another patrol car pulled into the lot, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached. One of them, a lieutenant, made a beeline for Anna, his face lighting up with recognition. "Evs, Blake," the lieutenant said, nodding respectfully. "I received a call from dispatch. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Lieutenant," Anna replied, though her tone carried a vote of authority that left no room for doubt about who was in control. "However, there's an issue with one of your officers that needs to be addressed immediately." The lieutenant's gaze shifted to Mike, his expression hardening. "I see," he said, his voice low. "We'll handle it." "See that you do," Anna said firmly. "Because if you don't, I will." With that, she turned and walked toward her car, the crowd parting to let her pass. Phones continued to record as she opened her door and retrieved her belongings, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She paused briefly, looking back at the crowd, then addressed them directly. "Thank you for bearing witness tonight," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "Your vigilance ensures that accountability is not just a word but a reality. Keep demanding better from all us." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the night. Mike watched helplessly as Anna climbed into her car and drove away, the weight of her words hanging in the air long after she was gone. Harper turned to the lieutenant, his face grim. "I'll escort Hardy back to the station," he said. "We've got a lot of paperwork to do." The lieutenant nodded. "Make sure it's thorough." And Hardy, he fixed Mike with a cold stare. "Pray this doesn't end worse than it already has. Because if it were up to me, you'd already be out." Mike didn't respond. He couldn't. All he could do was follow Harper to the patrol car, the roar of the crowd, and the sting of Anna's words echoing in his mind. The realization of what he'd done, and the consequences that would follow, hit him like a tidal wave. His career, his reputation, his very identity, all of it was crumbling before his eyes. And there was no one to blame but himself. The air in the parking lot had changed, crackling with tension and the weight of what had just occurred. Anna Blake's departure left an echo, a stark reminder of the balance of power that had shifted in an instant. The crowd lingered, their phones still raised as they captured the aftermath, their voices blending into a cacophony of indignation and triumph. Some were chanting for justice, others shouting pointed remarks toward Officer Mike Hardy, whose career now hung by the thinnest of threads. Mike, standing by the patrol car, looked as though the ground had been pulled from under him. His eyes darted nervously from the crowd to Sergeant Harper, who was still glaring at him, arms crossed in a stance that made it clear he had no sympathy left. The weight of the evening's events bore down on him like a ton of bricks. Every decision, every misstep, every word spoken in arrogance or haste now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. His body was tense, his breathing shallow. The arrival of Lieutenant Harper added an ominous finality to the situation. The lieutenant, a seasoned officer with years of experience navigating crises, stepped forward and surveyed the scene. His expression was cold and professional, his eyes calculating. He had seen moments like this before, officers who crossed the line, their actions sparking a storm of public outrage. But rarely had those moments involved someone as powerful and influential as Anna Blake. The implications of what had just transpired were enormous, and the lieutenant knew it. "Hardy," the lieutenant said, his voice low and measured, though it carried an unmistakable edge of steel, "step away from the car." Now, Mike hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground as though moving them would confirm the magnitude of his failure. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, some mocking him, others demanding accountability. A few bold voices called out for his badge and gun, their anger boiling over in ways that made Mike's stomach churn. "Step away," the lieutenant repeated, his tone sharpening. "This isn't a request." With great reluctance, Mike obeyed, his movements slow and mechanical. He stepped back from the patrol car, his hands twitching at his sides as though he wasn't sure what to do with them. He felt utterly exposed, the eyes of the crowd, his colleagues and the cameras all fixed on him. He could feel their judgment, their disdain. It burned through him like acid. The lieutenant approached the patrol car and gestured towards Sergeant Harper. "Harper, get his badge and weapon," he ordered, his tone clipped. Harper didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his expression grim, and faced Mike directly. "Hand them over," he said, holding out his hand. "Now." Mike's breath caught in his throat. "Sarge, come on," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're not serious." "I've never been more serious in my life," Harper replied coldly. "You've left me no choice. Hand them over." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. their voices rising in unison as they watched Mike's downfall unfold. The phone zoomed in, capturing every detail of the exchange. Mike felt his face flush with shame as he reached for his badge, the metal cool and heavy in his hand. He unclipped it from his chest and placed it in Harper's outstretched palm, the weight of the moment almost too much to bear. His gun came next. His hands shook as he unholstered it, the familiar grip now feeling alien and unwelcome. He handed it over without a word, his eyes fixed on the ground. The cheers from the crowd grew louder, their satisfaction at seeing him stripped of his authority palpable. "Thank you," Harper said curtly, stepping back with the badge and gun in hand. He turned to the lieutenant and nodded. "It's done." The lieutenant gestured toward the crowd, his voice rising to address them. "Everyone, please clear the area," he said firmly. "This situation is under control. We'll be conducting a full investigation, and appropriate actions will be taken. For your safety, I'm asking you to disperse." The crowd hesitated, their collective energy still high, but slowly they began to comply. Some muttered complaints, while others shouted parting words of encouragement to Anna Blake, despite her absence. A few lingered, phones still raised, unwilling to leave until they were certain the scene was over. The lieutenant turned back to Mike, his expression hard. "You're done for the night, Hardy," he said, his voice cold. "Go home. You'll be contacted tomorrow with further instructions." Mike's head shot up, his eyes wide. "Home?" he stammered. "But—" "Don't argue with me," the lieutenant snapped. "You've done enough damage tonight. The best thing you can do now is leave and stay out of the way." Mike hesitated, his pride battling with the reality of the situation. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He turned and began walking toward his personal car, his movements slow and heavy. The crowd jeered as he passed, their voices chasing him like ghosts. "Racist cop," someone shouted. "Better find a new job, buddy," another voice called. Mike didn't look back. He couldn't. Every step felt like a march toward the end of the life he had built, the career he had once been proud of. By the time he reached his car, his hands were trembling so badly that it took him several tries to unlock the door. When he finally slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, the world outside became a blur of sound and movement. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, the weight of his actions suffocating him. Meanwhile, back at the gas station, the lieutenant and Sergeant Harper stood by the patrol car, their expressions grim. Harper broke the silence first. "This is going to blow up," he said quietly. "It's already halfway across social media. By tomorrow morning, the chief's going to have every reporter in the city banging on her door." The lieutenant nodded. "And she'll have every right to be furious. This isn't just a PR nightmare, it's a failure on every level. Hardy crossed the line, and now we're all going to pay for it. Blake won't let this slide," Harper added. "She's got every reason to push for a full investigation, and honestly, I don't blame her. What Hardy did was indefensible." The lieutenant sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'll get started on the paperwork. Make sure the reports from everyone involved are on my desk by first thing tomorrow. And Harper, keep an eye on Hardy. I don't trust him not to make things worse for himself." Harper nodded. "Understood." As the lieutenant walked away, Harper glanced toward the edge of the parking lot, where a few stragglers from the crowd remained. He could still hear them talking, their voices buzzing with the excitement of having witnessed something monumental. And it was monumental. The night's events were more than just a singular incident, they were a symptom of a larger problem, one that Anna Blake had vowed to fight against. Back in her car, Anna drove in silence, her hands steady on the wheel. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her mind was racing. She replayed the encounter with Mike Hardy over and over, each detail sharpening her resolve. This wasn't about her, not really. It was about every person who had been in her position and hadn't had the power or privilege to fight back. It was about changing a system that allowed officers like Hardy to thrive unchecked. As she pulled into her driveway and parked the car, Anna sat for a moment, staring at the house in front of her. The night had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Tomorrow would bring new battles, meetings, reports, investigations, but tonight she allowed herself a moment of quiet victory. She had stood her ground, demanded accountability, and reminded everyone watching that no one, not even those with a badge, was above the law. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked toward her front door, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Behind her, the city buzzed with the aftermath of what had just occurred. But Anna didn't look back. Her focus was forward, on the work that still needed to be done. The following morning, the city was abuzz with the fallout from the night before. The video of Anna Blake's encounter with Officer Mike Hardy had gone viral, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. Millions of views, countless shares, and an avalanche of comments dissected every moment of the incident. Headlines blared from news websites and TV channels. Internal Affairs: Keefe confronts rogue cop in parking lot clash. Racial profiling incident sparks outrage. And police officer stripped of badge after shocking encounter. The footage was damning. It captured Hardy's aggressive demeanor, Anna's unwavering calm, and the crowd's growing outrage. But most importantly, it spotlighted a system that many believed was long overdue for change. By the time the morning rush hour began, the city's police department found itself at the center of a media storm. Anna arrived at the precinct early, her presence immediately commanding attention. She walked through the halls with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floors. Every officer she passed turned to look, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Whispers followed her, fragments of conversations that she chose to ignore. She had one goal today: to ensure that what happened last night would not be swept under the rug. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was tense. The chief of police, a seasoned woman with graying hair and an air of quiet authority, sat at the head of the table. Around her, senior officers and department heads shuffled papers and avoided each other's eyes. Anna entered without hesitation, her calm composure a stark contrast to the nervous energy in the room. "It's Blake," the chief said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Thank you for coming in so early. We need to address this immediately." Anna sat, her back straight and her expression neutral. "I couldn't agree more, Chief." The chief sighed, glancing at the stack of reports in front of her. "I've reviewed the preliminary details of the incident. Needless to say, this is a catastrophe for the department. The video is everywhere. Public confidence is already tenuous at best, and now this. We can't afford to ignore it." Anna nodded. Ignoring it isn't an option. What happened last night wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a deeper issue. Officer Hardy's actions were reckless, discriminatory, and completely unacceptable. If we don't address this head-on, we're complicit in perpetuating the problem. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the table. The chief leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I assume you've prepared a recommendation." "I have," Anna replied without missing a beat. She slid a folder across the table, the neatly organized documents inside detailing her proposed actions. First and foremost, Officer Hardy must be placed on indefinite suspension pending a full investigation. Secondly, I'm requesting that the department launch a mandatory review of all officers' records to identify patterns of misconduct, particularly those related to racial profiling. Murmurs broke out among the officers. One of them, a burly man with a skeptical expression, raised a hand. With all due respect, Ems, Blake, doesn't this seem like overkill? Hardy made a mistake, sure, but… Anna cut him off, her voice sharp but controlled. A mistake. Let me clarify something for you, Captain. What Officer Hardy did wasn't just a mistake, it was a blatant abuse of power. He detained me without probable cause, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and violated multiple protocols in the process. And if he felt emboldened enough to treat the head of internal affairs that way, imagine how he treats citizens who don't have the same protections I do. The captain fell silent, his argument dissolving under Anna's piercing gaze. The chief cleared her throat, bringing the room's attention back to her. Ivs, Blake is right, she said firmly. We've ignored these issues for too long, and now we're paying the price. Effective immediately, Hardy is suspended. The review of officer records will commence within the week. Anna inclined her head slightly, satisfied but not triumphant. This was only the beginning. Outside the precinct, the media frenzy had reached fever pitch. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones in hand, as camera crews jostled for position. When Anna emerged, the questions came at her like a hailstorm. Ivs, Blake, how do you respond to claims of systemic racism within the department? Do you believe Officer Hardy should be terminated? What message does this incident send to the community? Anna paused at the top of the steps, her gaze sweeping over the sea of reporters. She raised a hand, and the noise subsided just enough for her voice to carry. Last night's incident was deeply troubling, but it was not unique, she began, her tone measured and authoritative. It shone a light on issues that have plagued law enforcement for far too long, issues of bias, abuse of power, and the erosion of trust between officers and the communities they serve. As head of internal affairs, I will not allow these issues to go unaddressed. Accountability is not optional. It is the foundation of justice, and we owe it to the people we serve to uphold it without compromise. The crowd erupted in questions again, but Anna turned and walked away, her statement hanging in the air like a declaration of war against the status quo. By midday, Hardy's suspension was officially announced. The department released a carefully worded statement promising transparency and reform, though it did little to quell the growing public outcry. Protests began to gather outside the precinct, a mix of community activists, local leaders, and citizens who were tired of the same stories playing out time and time again. In his small apartment, Mike Hardy watched it all unfold on his television, his stomach in knots. The suspension had been expected, but seeing it announced to the world was a different kind of humiliation. The footage of the incident played on a loop, dissected by pundits and commentators who tore into his actions with unrelenting fervor. He had become the face of everything wrong with policing, a symbol of a system's failures. He rubbed his hands over his face, the reality of his situation sinking in. His phone buzzed with messages, some from colleagues offering half-hearted sympathy, others from strangers hurling insults and threats. He ignored them all. What could he say? What could he do? He had no defense, no justification that would make this right. Meanwhile, Anna returned to her office, the adrenaline of the day finally beginning to wane. She sat at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her, and stared out the window. The city stretched out before her, vibrant and alive, but also burdened by the weight of its struggles. She thought about the people who had stood in that parking lot last night, recording the injustice they witnessed. She thought about the countless others who had experienced similar encounters but didn't have the luxury of cameras, of witnesses, of justice. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from the chief. Good work today. Let's keep the momentum going. Anna set the phone down and leaned back in her chair. Good work, maybe. But there was so much more to do. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had taken a stand, not just for herself but for everyone who deserved better. And she wasn't done yet.